But we'll get started. So welcome to this symposium, Expanding the Restoration Toolkit. This is something that's co-organised by myself, Shoo, and Valerie Hagger here in the front. And we're really excited to be able to pull together a bunch of talks, which I hope you'll enjoy. So part of the motivation of this symposium is really being part of the discussion that to confront this idea that restoration is a simple endeavour that only really has one tool. So we all know that it's much more than that. I also believe that expanding the restoration toolkit that we currently have is going to be part of the solution that we need to be able to accelerate forest restoration, make things more cost effective, and also avoid repeating mistakes of the past. So I'm excited to have this chance to carve out a bit of space in this symposium to, I guess, reflect a little bit on how far we've come in recent decades, but also to think a bit more broadly about where we might be in the future. I think it's too early to say what the real potential of restoration is. We haven't tried everything, and I think there's a whole bunch of things that we don't know yet. We don't even know yet what we haven't tried. And so this sentiment is reflected in some of these popular books where writers have travelled broadly, scouring the globe for examples of different sorts of projects that people are trying in restoration and trying to think ahead about what the solutions for restoration might look like. And I think we've come a long way in recent times, and one of the themes from those books is really to be thinking about where we're going next. And like probably lots of people, I have developed the habit of having a mental scrapbook where I just feed with examples of things that are either challenge the way I think about restoration or make me excited about where things are going to go next. And I'd like to introduce some of the speakers, but before I do, I just thought I'd skim through a few examples that give you a bit of a sense of what the kinds of things that we're getting at, and hopefully we'll get you a little bit excited about one or two things that maybe you haven't considered before. So where to start? So I'm going to start right at the beginning, and that is the choice of whether to do something on nothing at all. And as most of you be aware, there's been a lot of work in recent times really looking at the value of regrowth or natural regeneration, where it's working and where it's not. And clearly, some ecosystems have the capacity to regenerate on their own without doing anything. But in our own work and in lots of work that people have been doing in other places, we find it's notoriously variable, the outcomes from restoration. And this can be a real barrier to the uptake. So I think there's a real space here to try to not make this a perfect choice, but reduce the risk around this choice, to give a little bit more certainty about what do you expect to happen if you do nothing. So this is an example from Costa Rica where there's just two essentially the same sites. One's regenerated very little and one regenerated a lot in the same time frame. So I'm interested in some of these projects where people have started looking at instead of saying yes or no to an intervention, maybe pausing for a little bit and saying there's something in between there where we can watch for a little while, get some sort of early indication of what's going on, and then make a decision that might give us a bit more certainty about what's going on. So again, this is the case in Costa Rica. This is a project from Karen Hull's lab where they've taken advantage of some control sites that they've had in their experiment that they've followed over a decade. And they said, what did we see at a year and a half? And what did that tell us about where we might be in longer periods of time? And it's not by no means perfect, but it certainly helps reduce the uncertainty. They've found some things that you would think would be quite obvious, but they've put numbers on them. So things like the amount of grass cover, canopy closure, and the evidence of seedling regeneration can tell you a lot about whether you're likely to be in this situation or whether you're likely to be in this situation in about 10 years. But further to that, let's say we're in a situation where we have lots of regeneration happening. That doesn't necessarily mean you do nothing. There are a whole lot of things that are being trialled around the globe now for sites that are perhaps going in the right direction but could be accelerated, or there is some sort of need to accelerate those sites. So examples of this are people experimentally removing or thinning pioneers from early regeneration and seeing where that steers forest communities. Manipulating some of the life forms in young regeneration, so things like managing vines. And this could be both native and non-native vines. We're also, as time goes on, I think we're getting a much broader understanding of the role of non-native species in regeneration, and we're starting to think more broadly beyond natives are good, non-natives are bad, and maybe there is a role for piggybacking on some non-natives to get us where we want to go in a more efficient way. In some cases it might mean reviving practices that are being used for very long times in agroforestry, for example, where they're using domestic animals to reduce the workload in managing some of these forests. So this is an example from northern New South Wales who have been trialling domestic pigs to manage lantana over large areas with very little effort. And there's a lot of work to be done about the nuances of that, of how intensively to graze for how long, to get that mix right of managing some life forms and then encouraging regeneration. We can also be in the other end of the extreme where we're faced with a situation where we've paused, we've looked at the regeneration and really it's not moving very much at all. So again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to jump into a most intensive model of regeneration. There are potentially other options. And this could be, this is largely around trying to narrow down what is the barrier to regeneration and see if you can selectively knock out that barrier and make some progress in it with less intensive inputs. So this is an example from North Queensland where we've simply taken areas that are adjacent to intact forest, pastures adjacent to intact forest, and done nothing more than just reducing the competition from pasture grasses. And this is about 3.5 years on, we start getting a developing community. And so this has been a bit of a watch and learn exercise about how much intervention do you need to keep putting into these systems to keep them going in the right direction? And is that eventually going to end up in a situation where we get where we want to go but at less cost? I think another exciting area is around soils. I don't feel like we've really exhausted the possibilities with understanding soil. And there's a lot of exciting work that's been going on in recent years about the biology of soils. Soils are more than just the chemistry, and perhaps if we can get the biology fast-tracked, we can do something much better with above-ground restoration. And so as we're starting to understand the biology of soils better, people are also starting to experiment with things like inoculating soils over large areas and seeing what that does to the trajectory of restoration. So I think it's an exciting area that we're only just starting to get into. We also have a whole body of work that is trying to say, are there other alternatives to going through a traditional propagation process where you perhaps collect seed, grow them up in tube stock in a nursery and then plant them out? So can we bypass any of that process? So this is an example trialling using large vegetative stakes. So this is off a keystone species, so trialling this with fig species. So taking large established stakes and planting them directly in the ground. So this is, very early days, but these sorts of methods have been used in agricultural settings for a long time, but it's about trying to apply them to conservation or ecological restoration. And it seems to have some promising success so far. We also have some really exciting work where people are playing around with different layouts of planting. So do we really need to plant whole areas? Can we get away with planting islands of vegetation? We've got a huge amount to learn here, and there are some examples now in tropical restoration where people have had these experiments going for 10 plus years, and we're starting to get some indication of where they're going and how they compare to a traditional plantation where you might plant a whole area. And it's really interesting to see what the outcomes of these things are, not just for the plants and the regeneration, but the response of fauna to these more mixed situations. And the last general area that I just want to quickly touch on is this whole idea of maybe we get a forest back, but in many systems we have this predictable set of life forms or species that seem to be incredibly slow to come back into these systems. So the idea is, can we start to fast track some of those things that are going to take a very long time to get back into systems? And one life form that often comes up if you look at regrowth is epiphytes. They seem to be really slow and tropical to recolonise tropical systems. So this is an example where people are taking and transplanting epiphytes and seeing if they can speed up that process. Originally we were going to have a speaker, Sergei Volis, talk about this in the symposium, but I think it's another exciting area where people are thinking very strategically about using threatened species in restoration to restore systems and using restored systems to recover threatened species. And certainly people do this in practice already, but thinking about this in a really strategic way, there's some efficiencies that we'd be bringing to that process. Some of you, perhaps if you went to the equivalent conference a couple of years ago in New Zealand, you might have had a chance to look at some of the work in New Zealand where large fenced enclosures have been established, these large island restoration projects, predator-free enclosures, where they're now at the stage where thinking a lot about putting back some of the species that are missing. So once you've really got some of the threatening processes out of the way, going back and putting back all of the missing pieces. It's another exciting area for restoration. On a higher sort of process level restoration, we're learning lots in recent years about the role of keystone species and all of the interactions between species. So in this case, getting wolves back into a system and its flow-on effects to vegetation. So it's not just thinking about the vegetation, but all of the bits, all of the components of the system that make things work. And further afield then is in situations where the keystone species no longer exist. So we've got extinct species looking for ecological equivalents. So going searching for species that perhaps will replace that function and being able to reintroduce those species into a system and see if we can kickstart that sort of process. So this is, again, an area that's not been a lot of work done, but is showing some really interesting results. So that's just an example of some of the breadth of work. I know that this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a grab bag of examples, and it's a lot skewed towards tropical forest restoration. But hopefully it will give you some idea of where we're heading. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, John Dwyer, and he's going to talk about using traits in restoration.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks to Valerie as well for organising this and inviting me to come and talk to you. If I step away from that mic, you can hear me right? I feel like a bird in a cage, standing behind the lectern. So today I'm going to tell you about... Oh, no, I don't know. No.
I have 2 different rooms that shouldn't be bad. As long
Oh,
as
I can't. No, I just feel like a plonker. It's all right. If you can hear me, that's cool. Thanks anyway. Sorry. So I'm going to present some work that I've actually done with Luke recently, an honour student of ours, Ronnie, and some good people at the Oxley Creek Catchment Association. And if I would have written this talk 2 years ago, it would have had a very different title, and it wouldn't have involved heat waves. So I see every restoration intervention as an opportunity to learn something. Whether it be planting trees and seeing how they survive and grow, watching seeds germinate for direct seed, or any weeding intervention, whatever you like, any of the interventions Luke's just talking about. It's an opportunity to learn. You can learn something from monitoring in particular ways that you won't learn if you, for instance, just took a photo, and I think photos are fantastic, don't get me wrong. So I just want to sort of put that out there, that I see restoration as an opportunity to learn about, in this case, a whole bunch of species are being planted. We can find out how well they worked here, and we can compare that to how well they worked somewhere else. And you might be able to compile a data set across the nation or across the region or whatever, and use that information to make better decisions. And this is something that they're doing in urban landscapes. This is an initiative in New South Wales, Which Plant Where. They're looking at successes and failures in urban settings. They're collecting data in a rigorous way, in a way that they can compare across sites, and then you can make more informed decisions. And they bring all the data together to provide information about what species grow in urban environments, and with a view to the future. Now, this idea about treating restoration as an opportunity to learn is not mine. I've had conversations with all of these people about it, and I'm sure people have had these conversations for decades before us. So I'm not trying to claim anything new here. But that just is a little bit of a background as to if we collected data in a sort of consistent fashion and then shared the information, compiled the information and provided useful summary data, we might be able to make some good decisions. And to take that to the extreme, we might even be able to embed experiments into a whole bunch of restoration projects across Australia and across the world. And indeed, this paper came out last week, and it's this idea. We do this already in ecology. We've got the nut net, we've got plant pot net, we've got drought net, we've got all of this global network of experiments, and I can't see why we can't do more in restoration to embed really nicely designed experiments into our projects to learn. And so with that in mind, Luke and I were involved with this project, which I'll show you where it is in a second. So it's the Oxley Creek Common 20 Million Trees Restoration Planting, otherwise known as a randomised block trait-based ecological restoration experiment. So what am I talking? This is UQ, it's the Green Bridge, it's just down the road here. Luke and I live here, not in the same house, but we live in the same neighbourhood, and that's very convenient for us. And so we got involved to provide some advice to Oxley Creek Catchment Association, who'd been given a grant to plant some trees. Now, Oxley Creek, that region, this is a big floodplain, and it used to support a mosaic of paperbark and eucalyptus forests, and along the creek, riparian rainforest, which, well, yeah, might not look quite that good, but it was apparently rainforest. And that's the best historical photo I could find of Oxley Creek. It's not great up there. So we focused on restoration of rainforest because we were going along a creek corridor. And what the good people at Oxley Creek Catchment Association asked us is, what should be planned and how should we go about this? And so Luke and I pitched to them this idea that we could experiment with different assemblages and we could embed in the overall project an experiment with some replication. We wanted to cover as much environmental space as we could. And we wanted to monitor the data in a very rigorous way with the use of very helpful, hard-working honours students. So, I'm not going to talk about this much today, but one approach to designing assemblages for restoration that's really interests me is using functional traits. So these are things that you can measure on each species that tells you how that species earns a living. And there's a bunch of traits that we know are really related to things like seedling growth rates and drought tolerance. And so we can measure traits, we can feed these traits through models, and these models these models will produce assemblages. And I'm not going to talk about that because Daniel Ogden's going to talk about that tomorrow. And so I don't think he's going to dwell on it in his plenary, but he will in his talk. And there's also other talks tomorrow in the traits session. These are the papers that Daniel's written that show how to do this, but once again, I can't really go into it. This is the newest one, and I think it's a really, really exciting avenue. But of course, these are just hypothesis drivers at the moment. We need people to go out and test these things. So I won't go through the species selection procedure, just tell you that we came up with two mixtures, and anyone who does subtropical rainforest restoration will tell me straight away, we could have told you that. You don't need to do a quantitative model to say that these are the fast-growing species and these are the slower hardy ones. So we were interested in looking at that trade-off between site capture, being weeds, versus being, in the longer term, perhaps more drought hardy. So the design involved 20 plots. Now each 30 metres by 30 metres, and we had the hardy mix planted, the fast mix planted, and we randomly allocated those to these sort of pairs, and we spread them out along the planting area as much as we could along the creek. Each plot had about 400 trees, and so we got replication. We ended up putting just shy of 8,000 trees in the ground, so that's a lot. And the green areas here are being direct seeded, so they're getting trees in them as well. So the planting was undertaken. Apparently the stock was hardened. It wasn't hardened enough. In November 2016, and of course Luke and I don't know, we've cursed, I think, because it was a record-breaking heatwave in Brisbane, and so you can see we had below average precipitation. The blue is what we had, the dotted is the average, and of course much hotter temperatures. So these seedlings went in the ground during really, really, really undesirable weather conditions, put it that way. So when these got planted, we pre-randomised all the plants so that when they went in the ground they weren't in any particular order. So Luke and I had to go back around and map everything. So we went and mapped all of the seedlings, measured the height and identified every seedling. We knew where they were, so if we wanted to go back in there, we could. So I looked at this, Luke and I looked at this as, it's not the outcome that we wanted, as you'll see, but we can probably learn from this. And perhaps we should have anticipated it. I'll point to Val's talk that's coming up next about that. So I think we can learn from this. And it really helps that we set this up with a nice experimental design, and it really helps that Luke and I went around and knew how big things were at the start and where they were, so we could track those individuals through time. So today's question, as I said, this would have been a very different question without the heat wave, but do the heights and functional traits of seedlings predict their survival response to extreme heat? So this is something we can now ask. It wasn't what we set out to ask, but it's something we can ask, and we can get really good answers. And so Ronnie joined Luke and I, a good, hard-working, honest student, and he surveyed. He went and found these seedlings 3.5 and 6 months after, and I'm just going to give you a very brief initial survival story today. So here he is surveying. You can see that there's already been some losses. And so that's the overall survival. It was grim. So this is the first look at that. Like, more than half of the plants died. I just love watching this. It's the worst piece of acting I've ever seen. And interestingly, the hardy mix didn't have greater survival. It was slightly higher. And so, I guess when we thought about that being hardy, it wasn't, are they hardy to extreme heat when you're planting? That's a different shock or a different stressor. We were thinking about, would they be hardy once they're established in the face of something like prolonged drought? That's one more time. So I was interested in how the heights of these seedlings, because Luke and I, when we went around, there was huge variation within each species about how big the seedlings were when we got them. And so obviously heights are likely to have a really strong effect. And indeed, these are just logistic regressions, probability of survival here and height on that here. And so, good old Britannia, sure, if you put bigger seedlings in, they survived. But what we found for most species was some sort of hump-shaped relationship. Here we have Dwyer, and we see it's got an optimal height around about 30 centimetres, where it had the highest survival. And indeed, when you go across all of the species that we had in there, coloured by the mix that they were in, we can see these hump-shaped relationships are quite common. Even good old Earl had an optimal height of about 35 or 40 centimetres. So that was really interesting. And then I was interested in, can traits predict the shape of these relationships? What am I talking about with traits? So I'm going to have to really buzz through this. But what we did, Ronnie went and got seedlings of these species, and we measured a whole bunch of traits, including, I really don't like standing still. SLA tells you about how they invest in leaves, wood density. Pretty much all you need to know is that this axis here describes the economics of the plant, from fast-growing inquisitive species to conservative slow species. Then there was a different axis here that was all about the size of the leaves or leaflets, and then another one which was describing whether you were simple or compound. So we had three nice trait axes that we could try and explain the shape of these relationships with. And what we found was, yes, these traits did explain the shape of the relationship. And this is just some model predictions. So it's these predictions of the same space over here. So this goes from conservative or slow through to fast, and this goes from large leaves or leaflets through to small ones. And I've just excluded trait space that's not really represented by our species here. And you can see that whether you're conservative or acquisitive sort of changes how peaky that relationship is. And whether you're simple or compound shifts where your optimal height will be. And there's good reasons for why that might be, and I'm really happy to talk to people about why they think that might be the case as well, what it is about simple versus compound leaves. So we found that the species with compound leaves maybe need to be even taller. Okay. Now, when you do that for all of the species, and we're trying to use these traits to predict the shape, so these are the same species that I showed you here. These are just fixed to height for individual species. Here we've got now these predictions. The black line is the observed, and the green line is what we predict based on the traits of those species in a whiz-bang multi-level binomial model. Now, I'll point out here that there's some where I patted myself on the back and I thought traits are fantastic. Traits, yeah, they're great. But there's only 5 out of 23 that you can actually do that. So I'm not going to pretend traits are telling all the story. there's a few here where you might go, oh, they're okay, that's pretty good. There's a few where you might go, well, they're not great, but at least they're predicting the same optimal height, the same location of the peak. And then there's others where you just want to walk away. No deal for traits there. So the model was highly significant. Traits apparently are fantastic predictors of these things, but when you actually do the predictions, they weren't sort of consistently fantastic. There were some species, Protochima, hopeless. And it was obviously, there were some species that just tanked. Red cedar just tanked as well. Okie dokie. So seedlings about 25 to 35 centimetres tall had the highest probability of surviving these extreme heat conditions. So that's nice, and that's some information, I guess. We found that traits did influence the shape of that relationship and where the optimal height might be, but those predictions were quite poor for some species. I guess the take-home message is don't plant trees during a heat wave in Brisbane. Well, that's pretty stupid. And that is just the perfect handball to Val's talk. So thanks.
Well, I might use the microphone. That's all right, I don't mind. So thanks for that prompt, John. Yeah, so we've all been investigating using seasonal forecasting to manage weather risk in ecological restoration, and Luke and John's project, that was just happened to be a coincidence. We were already doing this research, but I've been doing it in collaboration with my supervisors, John Dwyer and Kerry Wilson, and also with Luke Shoo, whose great idea it was to consider seasonal forecasting to manage our risks. So we know that restoration is time and resource intensive, and there are many factors which influence success. On one extreme, we've got factors that result in successful restoration projects, such as having a big patch size and shape, having proximity to existing vegetation, doing control of weeds and pests, having, using a characteristic species assemblage of our target ecosystem, and then also selecting species which might have local provenance or be suitable to future climatic conditions. And then also undertaking remediation of the site if it's been disturbed. And on the other extreme, we have factors which can result in failure of restoration projects. So you've got your natural events, your flood, fire, drought, cyclones, and then also your local climate. So just like what's the rainfall going to be, what's the heat going to be. And then again, you've got your threats, so your weeds and pest animals, if they're going to outcompete with what you've planted, or are they going to eat them. And then you've got all your sort of socio-ecological constraints, so your financial and logistical things that might constrain your project. And then also, what's the existing site like? So what was the land use previously that might have left a legacy to have ecological and physical barriers to restoration. So, there's a multiple factors that can result in, a restoration project being a success, but despite this, despite these many factors, not much is known about how people perceive these factors being a risk, and most importantly, whether people's perceptions match reality. So we undertook a survey of restoration stakeholders across Australia. We surveyed over 1,000 people, and from that we got about 300 responses, which is a 30% response rate, which is not bad in terms of social science. We attempted to survey, representative stakeholder types, from local governments to private, to Australian government, to local community groups, volunteers. And we asked them many questions. Oh, and we also tried to survey all the states and territories of Australia. And from that, we had underrepresentation from Northern Territory and Tasmania, and some of the research organisations and the Australian government. So we asked them many questions on what their motivations are for undertaking restoration, how their approaches to plan, implement and monitor those restoration projects, and also to try and get some data on what their methods were and the associated costs. So we asked them a number of questions on, risk to restoration, and we asked them a question sort of to find out what the general risks are to their projects. Then we asked them to provide a case study to try and understand what the realised risks were. And then again we asked them if they'd been involved in a restoration project that had failed, to try and get to the underlying reasons why that project had failed. So these are the results of those questions. So in people's perceptions, when we ask them, what do you think are the general risks to your restoration projects? And the major risks that we found were financial constraints, pest animals, time constraints, and weed invasion. And then we asked them, what risks have you actually experienced on your restoration projects? And you still have financial constraints and weed invasion coming out as important, but then we start to see emerging that local climate and natural events are risks to those projects. And then we asked them, of those projects that they had been involved in that had failed, what were the major reasons? So although lack of maintenance was a major reason, the other major reason was local climate. So as you can see, you've got this mismatch between people's perceptions and their realities. So it suggests that people are not really, understanding and considering the risk of weather in planning their restoration projects. So in summary, weather is a key factor affecting outcomes, but does not seem to be adequately tackled in planning due to perhaps a lack of perception, or perhaps they just think it's out of their control. But we do need to have better management of weather risk in restoration. We came up with the idea of the potential to use seasonal forecasting in decision making and to incorporate it within restoration planning to improve outcomes. And seasonal forecasting is already being used in the fisheries and agricultural industries to maximise yields. It's also being used in the Great Barrier Reef to do management of coral bleaching events. And it has, come a long way in recent years. So this is a paper from Alistair Hobday, which really summarised the use of seasonal forecasting well in the fisheries industry. And you can see that, weather and climate forecasting is done in a range of timescales. So in the beginning there, you've got, your short-term weather forecasting, so that can predict what's going to happen next week. But mainly, that's reactive management because you have minimal warning time to do much about it. And then on the other extreme, you've got your long-term climate projections, so you can use that to, do ecological resilience planning to make sure your plantings are resilient to warmer weathers. But in the middle there, you have seasonal forecasting, so that's where you can forecast sort of weeks to months ahead, up to one season or 4 months ahead. And that gives you sort of an early window for implementing management strategies where you can manage that weather impact. So in Australia, the Bureau of Meteorology, they do seasonal forecasting with POMA 2, so that's a dynamic ocean and atmospheric coupled model. It's at a resolution of 250 kilometres squared, and it's, they've got a forecast scale out to about 4 months. But that's due to be replaced by Access this year. That's the UK's Meteorology Office's current forecast model, and that's got a much higher resolution. It's also better able to predict, climate drivers like El Nino, Southern Oscillation. So this is another good figure by Hobday, which sort of shows you that in order for seasonal forecasting to be useful, it has to have an appropriate forecast skill. So the forecast skill has to be able to incorporate, what's your decision lead time, the time you're required to implement your management strategy that you could have available to respond to, unfavourable weather being predicted, and then still have a critical environmental period. So that's the period where you're, forecasted climatic conditions would be anticipated. So for seasonal forecasting to be useful for restoration in particular, it must first of all be needed. It must forecast climatic conditions of concern at sufficient skill and lead time. And we also have to have management strategies available to respond to those climatic conditions. And most importantly, we need to be able to quantify what the benefit is to minimise that risk. Otherwise, you're not going to have restoration stakeholders or practitioners uptaking the seasonal forecasting. And also, as with anything new, it has to overcome any challenges and constraints to implementation. So this just briefly summarises what our study aims and methods were to try and achieve all this. So firstly, we wanted to define the need in the restoration practice, as well as determine what the suitable forecast variables would be, and also the lead times. And then also to quantify what the benefit is to restoration projects. And to do that, we did a retrospective analysis of 18 case studies across Australia. So these were case studies from our original survey of those 300 responses of people that had identified weather as being a risk to their project. We went back to some of them and some kindly agreed to be involved, and we asked them further questions about what the weather issues were, what the impacts were, what the timing was and all that sort of stuff, and got some actual dates. And then we did a focus group with restoration stakeholders here in southeast Queensland, trying to involve a range of people from different disciplines in restoration, many of you which are here. From that, we were able to identify what would be the constraints and challenges, that even if we developed a seasonal forecasting tool, how could that be used? And from those sort of challenges, we tried to develop a prototype forecast product to demonstrate what it would look like and how it could be used. So this is what we identified from our retrospective analysis in terms of what are the climatic concerns and how that relates to what your critical variables would be that you would like to use in forecasting, and then what would be the lead times of that forecast. So in terms of weather issues, we identified the main issues to restoration projects were dryness and drought, so a lack of rainfall or no rainfall, or too much rainfall resulting in flooding, in particular for riparian restoration projects. Extreme heat, as in the case for Luke and John's project, killing plantings, and then we had frost, which can also kill plantings as well, and then again we had strong winds and cyclones. And these impacted, the impacts on plantings were, ranged from minimal to extreme. You could have a loss of seed or damage to plantings. There'd be poor germination or growth, also soil erosion, and then there were the additional costs and time associated for having to do additional mitigation or maintenance. And the timings of these impacts were either immediately after, up to 6 months after, and sometimes even before as well. So this shows that, the appropriate forecast variables will be rainfall, T-min and T-max, and we've got some lead times there of, fortnights to a month to the first season. So this is just one of the case studies that I used to sort of just demonstrate what the weather impacts would be. So it was planted in April 2013. They experienced a dry winter that year. Then they had a severe frost the next year, and then flooding the next year. Seasonal forecasting would have provided a benefit for that first encountered issue because we predicted that dryness, a lack of rainfall within that first season. So what are the benefits to restoration case studies? So this is quite significant from our retrospective analysis. We found that the forecast variables are able to predict 88% of the issues encountered, so apart from cyclones and strong winds. And 67% of case studies had the first issue occur within the forecast scale. So we were able to predict the weather impact in nearly 2/3 of the cases, which is quite good. But subsequent issues generally occurred outside the forecast scale. And I won't go into the management strategies, we don't really have much time, but we did identify, management strategies that are available to respond to unfavourable weather, like doing the timing of your site prep, or how you select species, to retaining money to do like supplementary watering after. But you can also do treatments in preparation, and also how you schedule your planting. Either delay your planting until better weather is forecasted, or you could stage it to break up the risk. So this is an example forecast product. So this first panel shows your national product. So this is like the tercile probabilities, and it shows you this is the most dominant tercile probability for that time. So you've got the first fortnight, the second fortnight, the first month, and the first season. And this was that example that I showed before. So as you can see for the first season, that orange means it's going to be 33% drier than the historic average. So you would have seen that from this map that it's going to be in a dry period. And this is a local forecast product. This is, provides more detailed information on one graph, so you don't have to look through the map to find your location, and you've got the rainfall and your T-min and your T-max all on one graph. In terms of the constraints and challenges that we identified, so in the focus group, a big one was, a lack of proof of concept. So we have time to go through all these, but all these, most of these constraints can be overcome, I think, in developing a forecast product. So in terms of what are the implications for practice, well, here we present a decision support tool which can be used to improve outcomes in restoration by identifying the risk management strategies during planning, assessing the forecast a month prior to revegetation activities, and adapting decisions if extreme weather is forecasted. But also useful for other conservation actions, not just restoration, that rely on weather for successful implementation, such as ecological forecasting. So the next steps really is to get some industry support around this, try to get some proof of concept about implementing it in case studies, and then hopefully develop a forecast product within Australia that all restoration practitioners can use. Thanks.
All right. What I want to talk about is our flagship, the Sydney Botanic Gardens flagship project, which is Restore and Renew. And Restore and Renew aims to add an additional tool to the fantastic tools and expertise that we've been talking about here today. It's about providing additional evolutionary, environmental, and ecological information to support restoration projects in general. So, one of the objectives of ecological restoration is to re-establish self-sustaining populations that hopefully will last the test of time. And we've become increasingly aware that the evolutionary side of things is particularly important. We need to be able to maximize diversity, to increase the viability of populations, and we need to be aware on how we provenance material. And there's been quite a large number of theoretical scenarios and models that have been published, and they're all very valid and useful. They consider also future potential, how to make those populations future ready. But the issue with those is that at the end of the day, they are still limited by the lack of empirical data. What is a local provenance anyway? If we want to mix local and non-local provenance, where do we find the boundaries of those provenances? Which one are the populations that are adapted to potentially adapted to future conditions? And we know that it's very difficult to generalize about those things, that two species are not going to behave in the same way, no matter how closely related they are, and I'll show you some examples later. So the objective of Restore and Renew was to gather the information, initially across New South Wales, information on genetic diversity and how it relates to environmental conditions, so that we can then provide through a web tool that information directly to the practitioners, so they can make choices, informed choices, if they want to follow those particular scenarios. And to do those things, you really need to think big. You can't just do it for a small number of species, you need to do it for a large number of species. And so an initial objective is to target 200 species. 200 species were selected through a survey with restoration practitioners in New South Wales. As you can imagine, though, something like that is a bit of a logistic nightmare, and I'm not going to go through the details, but we probably spent the last 2 to 3 years just to develop and finalize all our analytical pipelines, our sampling strategies, the way we manage and collect data and metadata and material. But to cut a long story short, we have to be aware, of course, of realistic objectives. It has to be practical, it has to be cost-effective, and it has to be manageable at such a large scale. We cannot test thousands of populations for each species, obviously. So we select our sampling strategy by trying to ensure that we include in our analysis the full distribution. By full distribution, I mean geographic and environmental. We use environmental models to do that and distributional patterns to do that of every species. So we try to sample at least 30 to 40 populations per species. We also try to ensure that there is as much overlap in our sampling strategy between species to make it more cost effective, but also to make sure that in the future we can do all sorts of other comparative analysis. And then we have to make sure that we have a system to keep all the metadata as informative as possible. So we barcode material from the collections, and the same barcode follows all the way through to genomic analysis and through to material collection, through to data presentation, etc., etc. We then use one of the many genomic data analysis that are available to us these days. It's a commercial one. It's very efficient for us because it's something that we can obtain data very, very quickly and at a low cost. So we use data analysis. And then we transform. We put all that information together and we put it into the web tool, and I'll show you the web tool in a second, so that practitioners can access it, access the information that they need, and interpret it as easily as possible, and then explore all those scenarios and opportunities that we were talking about before. I'm not going to go into the details about how we analyze the data, how we use the data, but let's just say that we in order for us to be able to understand how genetic diversity is distributed across a population, and to build, to understand what the distribution of one provenance is, we use generalized dissimilatory models on our genomic data, and then we bring as variables what our data tells us is the most important variable that impacts on the distribution of diversity for that particular species. So it might be just geographic distance, it might be historical factors, so strong differentiation across the landscape, or it can be environmental factors. Let me just go onto the web tool. So I was going to do a live demonstration, but then I chickened out. But I can still show you, if you're interested, how it actually works. So this is how it appears once you start up. We've got a map there that can be a map or a satellite image. You can zoom in and out. And here you've got a panel with all the functions that you can use and you can access. There's a help manual up there that tells you how to go about it, what to do, how to interpret the data. First thing that you do as a practitioner, you select the location where you are working, and you can do that either by tapping let longs or just zoom in and select a site. And then from the draw down menu there, you can select the species. Now we only have half a dozen species because we're still finalizing the website, but the species will increase as we'll have more data, obviously. And these will be the species that we have data for that particular site. As you do that, this is what will come out. What we've got, and this is calculated on the fly based on new species and your location. And so what you've got, first of all, you selected location there. You've got DLA, ALA records for that particular species, just to give you an idea on where you can access material. And then this is what the genetic data, the GDM produces for this particular species at this particular site, which is the distribution of the genetic neighborhood for that particular species at that particular site. So what's in the highlighted area is local, genomically local. What it's not genetically local. This is the first set of information. The other thing that we're interested in providing, again, for you to be able to follow those provenance scenarios, is an understanding of how the environmental conditions will change, but not necessarily how the species itself is impacted by climate. We do give that information as well, and I'll show you in a minute. But what are the environmental conditions at your site? Because at the end of the day, that's what you need to know. So we do some fairly basic modeling to show you what are other environmental conditions based on the relationship between temperature and rainfall that are similar to the conditions at your selected site. And of course, we also provide you with an understanding of future climatic conditions, 2050 climatic conditions. So we show you what will be the conditions, where are the 2050 conditions that will be at your site. In other words, in 2050, the conditions at your site will change, but there are places that already have those conditions at the site, so that you can make selections based on that. So once you've got all that information, you can kind of respond, you can kind of use all those theoretical scenarios, provenance in scenarios. You can use local provenance only. You can use local provenances, non-local provenances. You can use local provenance, local conditions. You can use local provenances, future conditions. You can make whatever choice you want. The information is there. Just to show you an example how things are variable across different species, these are 4 species selected from the same sites, so the environmental conditions remain consistent. And as you can see, 4 different species respond very differently in across the same site. So we've got at the top there 2 species that where genetic diversity is is driven by an isolation by distance type model. In other words, the further you go geographically away, the more differentiated populations are. It's a pretty common system, and you can see those 2 species respond in a similar way. Interestingly, though, this particular species, it's so geographically localized that the whole species is a provenance. In this case here, the distribution of genetic diversity is more impacted by historical events, so there is strong structuring within the distribution of the species. And so the local provenance is much smaller, and although we cannot see it here, the model responds very clearly as you get closer and closer to the boundaries, so that as you get closer to the boundaries, this area, if the boundary is up north, this area will become smaller, and this area will remain the same, so that there is no overlap. Finally, this last species respond to environmental conditions, so it's an altitude, temperature type of response, and so the boundaries are much smaller, and also much less even, because altitude varies pretty strongly. So as you can see, 4 species that are pretty much co-distributed. They all sandstone species respond very differently. And interestingly, these are 2 acacias, co-distributed acacias. So it's really difficult to generalize. Oops. That doesn't look good. Oh. So as I was saying, we also provide more information. Once you had a look at your species, you can click on a summary button, and it provides a PDF with all that information and more information about the species, more information on how to maximize diversity, and more information about the species' response to climate change. So here, if the species, this summary graph shows that you've got more losses than gains, then you might make the decision that maybe this is one species where you need to consider future conditions as well. The interesting thing about the approach is that it's a live tool, so we can change and add more information as we go. But also we can use the analytical pipelines and the data sets for all sorts of other things. So, for example, we are using the information to develop strategies to support reintroduction of threatened species. We can do a kinship within a population, and then use a specialized algorithm to try to maximize diversity in a reintroduced population for a set number of individuals. So we want to bring in 100 individuals, how do we increase diversity in this reintroduced population? You might have to add 14 of those, 5 of those, 0 of those, etc., etc. I derived another option similar to that, but derived from that, and Tony Parks was talking about that yesterday in the Big Scrub session, is to provide the information to support seed production areas. So there, and this is an example for West Stringia in one of the coastal Sydney species. There what we can do, we can find the balance. When you've got a much broader population, we can find the balance between, for example, local and non-local material. Or if we have an idea of specific alleles that are associated with whatever we're interested in, which might be climate. This was relating to 30 alleles related to climate responses or disease or whatever. We can try to find the balance in a seed production area where we make sure that we bring in those genes that we're interested in without losing diversity. So if we focus too much on those specific genes, we might have lower diversity. If we focus only on the diversity, we're not going to have enough genes. So we can find a way in between that that will suit whatever our needs are. And so just to finalize where we're at, so far we've done more than 50 species. We've analyzed more than 50 species. We sample pretty broadly. For the moment we're focusing on New South Wales, so we started to move in Queensland and Victoria. The tool will be available hopefully early in the new year, we're hoping about 50 or so species. And more importantly, we are also interested in continuing doing a whole lot of value-add projects where we are doing research on specific questions that we can make sure support that in the type of research we're doing. And Marlene will be presenting one of those studies in the next hour or so. And I think that's all I've got. This is the team. Thank you very much.
Before I start, I would just like to acknowledge my collaborators on this project. It's quite a large team of people who have contributed to this project, and these are the main people listed here. I think we're at a really important point in the development of restoration globally at the moment. Never before have we had a clearer picture of the place for restoration around the globe. And at the same time, it's matched with increasingly ambitious targets for restoration of ecological systems. One of the challenges is when we go from this really big scale and we start to look at real landscapes, we're immediately confronted with this beautiful complexity and all of the issues associated with trying to take something that's a big idea and make it work in places. And this is really essentially what I'd like to talk about today, is the idea of trying to develop a process or a way to make spending and investment in restoration a little bit more strategic and transparent. And I'm going to talk about a project that we've tried to push this in the last 3 years and develop it to an application in a local government area on the east coast of Australia. So This is a project where we've deliberately partnered restoration ecologists, decision scientists and natural area managers together to try to make this work. So everybody brings a different part of the solution. And the area I'm going to talk about is the city of Gold Coast. It's one of the most biodiverse cities in Australia. It's more than 50% of its native vegetation. And the local government assists with conserving about 13,000 hectares of natural area estate through ecological restoration. So it's a large task. And to give you some sense of the complexity, at any one time there can be juggling 400 or so projects or programs across this natural area estate. We've really achieved some amazing things. They've restored more than 2,500 hectares, planted more than 54,000 native trees, so some really, really great progress. But what I'd like to talk about is seeing if we can't go a step further and come up with a way that allows us to identify and work in places that are going to get us the greatest outcomes from public investment in restoration as possible. So it's building off all of that good work, we're just trying to go to the next step. And in a simpler sense, we're talking about what to do, where and when. So we'd like to be in a position where perhaps we could say, in year one, these are the places where we really should be targeting, and then develop this, stitch this together as a sequence and say, the next year we'll go into these places and to these places. But it's about trying to get a clear process that will get us there. And I just want to step to the side for a moment and clarify that the science here is not to make the decision which are the risks worth taking or deciding what choices to make. What we're trying to do is be in a situation where we can indicate what the choices, constraints and possibilities are. So build a lot more clarity around that so people can make informed choices. And this is the basic approach we've taken. I've simplified a little bit, but not too much. Really, the first step has been trying to get really clear idea of what the objectives are, and from a decision science point of view, if you don't know what the objectives are, there's no problem and no problem to solve. So that's a really important part and it's worth labouring on. And then it requires pulling together all of the information that's in people's heads already, all the stuff about what are the restoration actions, what are the recovery timeframes, what are the costs involved in restoration, coming up with management strategies that will, and preferences for outcomes that will get you to where you want to go, and then identifying what the constraints are. So things like what is the restoration budget and any other logistical constraints that you need to be aware of. And the second step is we've been working very hard to develop a decision support tool, and this is essentially taking all of those bits of information and using mathematical tools that allow you to filter through all of the possible solutions and come up with the best ones. So I'm sure you can understand if you only have 2 sites to choose from, you could probably do it on the back of an envelope. But as soon as you start talking about many, many, many sites, it's too much to juggle in your head, and it requires some assistance to sift through all those possibilities. And the third step is about bringing some clarity and transparency to what the trade-offs are. So inevitably, if you make a choice on one thing, you may need to give up something else. But being clear about what you're giving up can be really important and helpful for making decisions. And really, we're used to doing this sort of stuff in our everyday lives, but it's trying to build this into a restoration. So an example of 2 different management strategies that might have different trade-offs. Let's say we've got a range of sites that are spread out across this continuum from quite degraded sites on the left to intact forest on the right. One strategy might be to shore up the best bits first. So you're essentially working from right to left. You'll be working on the best bits, improving the quality of those, and working out to the more degraded bits. Equally, you could make a case if what's really important to you is increasing cover, you might want to do the opposite and work in the opposite direction, go to the most degraded places and get them kick-started. And it's not immediately obvious what would be the implications of doing either of those choices. So this is the kind of thing that the tool can help with. So in this project, we've gone as far as developing a piece of software that allows you to, that forces you to refine what your objectives are, put in the information that you need to make a decision, what your preferences are, what you want the outcomes to be, and it provides a way of visualising finding the solutions and visualising what they look like. So in order to do this, in order to find solutions, we need to do a whole bunch of things. I won't go into detail about this, but essentially we need to characterise what the benefits of working in all of the different potential projects are and what the costs of those projects are. And importantly, as I'd indicate here, we want to make costs reflect the way costs play out in reality. So instead of just giving each project a once-off cost, we want to have a cost that will start a project and ensure that we've got the money there to finish the project. Likewise, in terms of recovery, we know that you don't just start a project and suddenly you get the end product. Different projects will take different amounts of time to improve in quality. And knowing these things helps you make much more efficient decisions. So as an example, we might have two restoration projects that are side by side that are in the same context, but they're a different vegetation type or a different starting quality, which would give you different costs and different recovery timeframes. Conversely, you might have two projects that essentially look the same on the site, but because of their context, they might cost different amounts of money. If we know that when we're looking for solutions, we can take account for that. So I'm just going to spend the rest of the talk giving examples of the pathways in which this can help make decisions. So going back to the very beginning of the talk, one of the simplest things we might want out of a tool like this is some support to say, here are all of the possibilities, here are all the possible projects that are reflected in grey dots on this map. The green dots are all the places that have currently received some work. But the next question is, where would you go next? So having some support to say, taking into account all of those things, where would we like to be next year? And then we can play that out saying, where would we expect to be in year 2, year 3, year 4, and so on. Another really useful thing is to forecast the outcomes of management strategies over long periods of time. And this is a really difficult thing to do, and especially to take the time to do this when there's a lot of pressure to be thinking about right now and what needs to be done right now. But we can take a situation where we know where we are right now, we know what our objective is. We can say one way to measure our progress against this objective would be how much habitat do we have in high quality at any one point in time. We have the ability to simulate what we'd expect to get over time if we just went in an ad hoc sort of manner, just went randomly all over the place. Clearly we'll make progress, but the benefit of using a tool like this is that every single step you can say, what is the next most cost-effective place to go to? What is the next? So the difference between those lines is essentially the benefit the gain you get by using a tool that does this strategically. Another question might be, how long will it take and how much will it cost to achieve some particular milestone for progress. So once we have this sort of forecast in place, we can say, for example, how long would it take to get halfway towards getting the whole restoration estate up to high quality?